Good evening. Happy Hanukkah to everybody. Thank you for joining. Hanukkah is 8 days of celebration. We all have so much to be thankful for. This class is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmat in memory of two young men, Yoshua Michal ben Aryeh Tzvi, alav Shalom, and David Mezel, alav Shalom. Being Hanukkah, I want to introduce one idea, a fundamental idea, which actually is noted right in the beginning of Bereshit. In the beginning of Bereshit, the world is described as a dark place, tohu vavohu, all confused, the choshech al pnei tehom, and there was darkness covering everything. And the Medrash says that this moment, this description, is in fact a description of the exile of Yavan, of the Greek exile of the Jewish people, which we're going to come to an understanding of in the course of tonight's class. And interestingly enough, how do we celebrate Hanukkah? We celebrate Hanukkah by lighting the Chanukah, by lighting candles, by bringing back to life, so to speak, the light that came from the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. And that light, of course, is very much associated with Torah or, that the Torah itself gives off light. And therefore, of course, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple as the place where Hashem lives in the world, was a source of light. And the menorah was lit every day by the Kohen Gadol to illuminate not just the Beit HaMikdash itself, but in fact to illuminate the whole world. And in our own small ways, we're doing that each night. We're remembering that. We're recreating that each night for 8 nights during Hanukkah. Now, just a word quickly about darkness. What does darkness do? So very famously, the Mesilat Yesharim says darkness does 2 things. One, we don't see what's in front of us. We could stumble, we could fall. Mesilat Yesharim describes a human being living without the guidance of Torah as a person walking in the darkness on a precipice where there is tremendous likelihood that he's going to fall off to obliteration. That's one thing darkness does. What's the other thing that Mesilat Yesharim tells us the darkness does? Darkness confuses us. So we see, as he quotes, the image of a human being looks like a thing, and the image of a thing in front of us can look like a human being. And it's interesting that that's the analogy he chooses, because I dare say we live at a time we're seeing the distinction and the distinctiveness of human beings is not so readily apparent to too many people. That's another thing that darkness does. So it creates a sense of blindness where we can easily fall off a precipice. And it also creates a sense of confusion where we can see something in front of us and completely miss the point and miss its meaning and miss its importance. And we can just walk on oblivious to what it really means. So this is the Greek exile. The Greek exile lasted for approximately 200 years. And it's unique in the 4 exiles of the Jewish people, which historically were deemed to be Bavel, when the first temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were sent off to Babylonia, Persia, which conquered the Babylonian Empire, ruled over the Jewish people at the start of the Second Temple for a brief period of time. And then Greek exile, which happened when Alexander the Great arrived in Jerusalem with his troops in the process of conquering the world. And then subsequently, towards the last 100 years of the Second Temple period, when we entered what we call the Roman exile, Edom, where we were really under the hand of Esav and the descendants of Esav. And that exile continues through to today, Thankfully, the land of Israel is in our hands to some extent. Thankfully, we can access all the holy places in Israel. However, we're still in exile until the time of redemption, when the entire world recognizes Hashem. So we're still living in darkness. I want to switch our attention now to Parshat Miketz, which not always, but invariably is read on the Shabbat of Chanukah. And just a very brief overview. Miketz begins with Joseph, wallowing in prison in Egypt, having been falsely accused of trying to seduce the wife of Potiphar, separated from his family, having been thrown into a pit and sold down to Egypt as a slave. And it recounts the two dreams that Pharaoh has, the recommendation that Joseph be brought out of the pit to interpret those dreams. Joseph comes before Pharaoh, he interprets the dreams correctly. He's placed viceroy, he becomes the ruler just under Pharaoh's leadership of all of Egypt. He implements all the reforms that are necessary. Eventually there's a famine, as predicted in the dreams. His brothers come down to Egypt once. He deals with them harshly, imprisons Shimon. They go back home. They come back a second time. He again deals with them harshly. He sends them back with the royal cup in the provisions of Binyamin, and he has his troops bring back these brothers to imprison Binyamin and make Binyamin into a slave forever. And that ends this week's Torah reading. There are, by the way, 2,025 words in this week's Torah reading. Not usual that we count the words in the Parsha, but the Torah Tamima tells us something interesting, that this fact that there are 2,025 words associates this Parsha with Chanukah, because ner in Hebrew, a candle, a light. And ner, by the way, doesn't mean a candle really. It means a source of illumination. And in Talmudic times, a ner was a little clay implement that you could hold in your hand, where you put a wick and filled it with oil, and it burned and gave you light. That's what the definition of a ner is technically. We think of it as a candle today. So ner equals 250. We light 8 candles total, so that's 2,000. And Chanukah falls on the 25th day of Kislev. It begins. So the Torah Tamima says that this is an illusion associating this week's Parsha with Chanukah. Why it's associated is not made specific. And I want to utilize some insights and a discussion presented by Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg a few years ago on this week's Parsha of Miketz to connect these ideas. Once Joseph becomes the viceroy of Egypt, he marries an Egyptian woman, and they have 2 sons. And the first son is named Menashe. And Yosef names his boys. And what it says in the Torah, and this is on page 230 in the Art Scroll, if you want to look it up, it's chapter 41, Pasuk Nun Aleph, sentence 51. Ki neshani Elokim et kol amori ve'et kol beit avi, which you will often see translated as, you can see what the Art Scroll says here. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's household. And this provokes a tremendous question. It would really cast, if you took it literally and simply, it would cast Yosef as celebrating the fact that here I was thrown out by my fellow Bnei Yisrael, children of Israel. I've managed to rise to the top on my own, so to speak, which we know isn't Yosef's perspective, especially when we see the way he spoke to Pharaoh. And now I can forget about my past. I can cut myself off from my uncaring brothers and my father who's forgotten me, and I can forget all of them, and I can live in success and majesty here in Mitzrayim. And nothing could be further from the truth in terms of what was in Yosef's mind. And as Rabbi Goldberg points out very interestingly, if he really wanted to forget about his past, he wouldn't have used his references to his father's house and his family in naming his son. So we get various explanations. The first one that's important to note is when he says the word forget, and by the word in Hebrew, nishani is an unusual word for forget. It means simply that I have forgotten the really bad parts of my experience. And what I have held on to is my longing to reconnect with my father and to reconnect with the Bnei Yisrael and rejoin the legacy and the destiny of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And hence, that's one way of understanding the word Menashe. Shamshin Raphael Hirsch, in his commentary on the Torah, takes it much further with a very interesting linguistic understanding. To be a noshe in Hebrew, nun shin he, means to be a creditor, to be indebted to someone else, to have a relationship where I owe you something, and therefore when a person comes and bangs on my door and says, give me back the money I lent you, he is deemed to be guilty of being noshe, of being an unwieldy, unreasonable creditor. And if the person's not able to pay him back, he's doing something that the Torah deems as wrong. Hence, here's Hirsch's translation. Hashem has transformed all my troubles and my father's household, turning them into my creditors. I'm indebted to them. I owe them. And in fact, we see ultimately towards the end of the book of Bereshit, we see how Yosef lives this out to the nth degree, most especially after his father Jacob dies in Egypt, and the brothers come to him and say, we're ready to be your slaves. We realize we wronged you. Yosef says magnanimously, but he doesn't just say it, he really feels it through and through. And he explains to his brothers that everything that happened in my life and all the actions you took against me were all orchestrated by God. They were all 100% for the good. And if anything, as he explains in the name of Menashe, I am in your debt for the manner in which you treated me throughout my life. And I would add a subplot to that. And that is because in a certain way, the Torah describes Yosef initially as being immature. And of course, we use these words very carefully when we're talking about people as great as Yosef, but it describes him as a nar, talks about him in the house of Potiphar being very concerned of his personal appearance because he was a striking looking person and he was very attractive to anyone who met him. But so included in this sense of Hashem transforming my troubles is, I would add the concept that Hashem, through my life experience, has transformed me into a person who's completely at one with Hashem, who's completely understanding and appreciative of everything I've been through, and who in fact values and cherishes every step of his life. And that's a perspective that Yosef took. And of course, it would be easy for us to say, great, if I won the lottery tomorrow and I became president of the United States, and if my life could mirror the outer successes that were born out of Yosef's troubles, I could adopt such an attitude also. I dare say you probably wouldn't. I probably wouldn't. I dare say that this requires an amazing sense of clarity of thinking, an amazing sense of choosing how I'm going to view my life and how I'm going to understand my life, and doing all of this in connection directly with Hashem, seeing the world as Hashem sees it. That's a sense of or, that's a sense of vayihi or, let there be light in the world. Hashem illuminates things for us. And the question is, do we see through a layer of darkness, and do we construe the items in front of us the way they're meant to be construed? Most especially, do we construe the people around us, the people we love, the people who are dependent on us, the people on whom we are dependent? Do we construe them as being part of the landscape the Gan Eden, you could even say, that God has placed us in. And if you want to see something, read something truly inspiring in this regard, I would just make a brief reference to to Dr. Edith Eger's book. And she was speaking to students in the Hebrew Day School once, and she said, Auschwitz was my classroom. And it's a bone-chilling statement to hear someone make. And what I would just say is that when Yosef names this firstborn child in the darkness of Egypt, with a sense of yearning to reconnect to his father and his father's household, and when he can go so far at this early stage of his life, age of 31, 32 years old, and to really express himself as though I owe a deep sense of gratitude, of course, to Hashem, but I owe it to each and every member of my family, each and every person I've interacted with, each and every person who had wronged me on a certain level, because I see so clearly that the reality that this moment that's taking place is orchestrated by Hashem, and it's all for the good. And indeed, there's an overview here of Hashem's perspective, which is when Jacob in this week's Torah reading complains to the sons before he sends them back to Egypt and says, you're leaving me in a sense of complete mourning. I've lost Yosef. I don't know what it'll be with Shimon. And now you're taking Binyamin away from me. The rabbis comment in the name of the Medrash saying that it's too bad Jacob couldn't see through the veil in front of him to see how Hashem is preparing a dignified manner for the Jewish people to go down to Egypt, which was foretold to Abraham 300 years before, and that this was all Hashem's plan, so that the Jewish people could eventually emerge from the servitude and the difficulty and the travail and the enslavement of Egypt as a Jewish people ready to be propelled to Mount Sinai, to receive the Torah there, and to illuminate the world throughout its history through the study of Torah, through the teaching of Torah, and through the clarity of vision and understanding that, as the Mesilat Yesharim said, is really only possible when a person consults with the Torah in order to be able to see through the darkness that seems around us. Now, I want to turn our attention to Chanukah. And what is Chanukah? And that's the question the Talmud says. And I want to read from you the Talmud, the Gemara on Shabbos, page 21b, which says explicitly, when the Greeks entered the Beit HaMikdash, they defiled all of the oil. When the Hashmonaim were victorious, they searched and could find only one jug of oil, which had remained pure with the seal of the high priest. And I think we know the rest. A question: what were the Greeks thinking when they entered the Beit HaMikdash? They defiled all of the oil. Just imagine, there's vivid portrayals today in recent history from diaries of British officers who, I think was when they burned the White House, I think 1812 or something like that. They came in, they occupied the White House in Washington. They sat down and they ate all the food, all the great food that had been left there by the president and his wife who escaped. They had themselves a grand, wonderful time. And then when they were done eating and celebrating, they burned the place down. In contrast to that, the powerful Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, come. They arrive at the temple. They enter it. And all they do is say, let's defile all of the oil. And you know how you defile the oil in the temple? You don't have to do much. All you have to do is take the flask of oil. You just have to break the seal of the Kohen Gadol, because it's that seal that protects the purity of the oil. So what do you think the Greeks were thinking when they came into the Beit HaMikdash? I want to suggest that what they were thinking was that we do represent darkness in comparison to the holiness of the Beit HaMikdash. How does this holiness become manifest in the world? It becomes manifest by a Kohen Gadol, by a high priest, a descendant of Aaron, in a sense of holiness, wearing special garments, each and every day pouring sanctified, pure oil into the menorah and lighting it. So if we want to create a world of darkness, if we want to end the influence of the Jewish people on humanity, this is where we start. All we have to do is pick up the flask of oil, break the seal, take away its holiness. We don't change it chemically or physically. We put it down. We've done our job, because we are preventing the world from seeing a holy, pure, sanctified glow of light, the kind of light that can enable human beings who are seeking to benefit from that light to distinguish between a thing and a person, to realize this is a precipice that I'm standing on, and if I take a step to the right or left, we'll leave it to your imagination, I'm going to fall off and I'll be damaged. And I can see that because there's a certain clarity of vision and light and understanding that illuminates my way forward. That's what the Beit HaMikdash represented. That's what the Greeks understood. That's why they were so expert at bringing darkness into the world. And I want to give you a reference, which I shudder to even quote, but in a book by Herman Wouk, he quotes a senior Nazi official that when the Nazis got together to meet about the final solution, eliminating Jews from the world, one of the leaders there, and I could look up his name, I don't remember right now, said, sure, we can easily get rid of these German Jews and the Western European Jews. That'll be no problem for us. But it's the Eastern European Jews, those so ingrained in Jewish tradition, those who, to us, cultured Germans, look like primitive people, they'll regenerate Judaism unless we wipe them out also. And hence the horrific plans of the Nazi regime was to carefully extend their reach to the East, to be sure that they could capture all of these Jewish communities, all of these, in their eyes, unwashed Jewish communities, because they, in their hatred of Judaism, also understood, like the Greeks, that this would be a source of rejuvenation and a source of continuity. And if we don't eliminate them, then we're not doing much to eliminate the light of the Torah and the light of the Jewish people and the opportunity for the Jewish people to offer guidance and moral uplift for the world. So it is breathtaking to just understand the extent to which the enemies of the Jewish people had an understanding of what it takes to eliminate Jewish life, to eliminate Jewish influence, to eliminate Jewish goodness from the world. They really have been experts, and we have to learn from their expertise what we have to preserve and what we have to hold and cherish. Another word about darkness. It's interesting to note that when you look at the scope of history of the world in very rough terms, if we're in the Jewish year 5,782, the first 2,000 years are called years of void. Why? Because until Abraham stood up in recognition of God and began teaching others, it was really 2,000 years of void, of decline of human history, where there was almost no voice of connection with God. Abraham comes with his initiative, rises to act on behalf of God, becomes a prophet, passes on his heritage to Yitzchak, Yitzchak to Jacob, Jacob to his 12 sons. We go through a 400-year period of enslavement in Egypt. We come out. We arrive at Mount Sinai, and there's a moment of revelation where God talks, speaks. There's prophecy on the part of each and every living Jewish person. The Talmud tells us that that era of prophecy launched at Mount Sinai, which happened 3,300 some years ago, was given a 1,000-year lifespan. There would be 1,000 years of prophecy in the world in order to, as Rabbi Tatz said the other day, charge the batteries of the Jewish people and give them the source of light to carry them all the way through till the end of human history. So if you go from the moment we stood at Mount Sinai in the Hebrew year 2448, and you project ahead 1,000 years to 3,448, you come almost exactly to the moment when Alexander the Great and his army approached Jerusalem and were met by by the Kohen Gadol Shimon HaTzadik. This is recounted in the Talmud. If you look in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, you'll see Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, was passed on to Yeshua to the elders to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Amongst them were prophets. They weren't all prophets, but amongst them were prophets. And then finally, Shimon HaTzadik, the high priest in Jerusalem, he begins the era of post-prophecy. This 1,000 years of revelations, the batteries seemed to be fully charged. And now the Jewish people were deemed to have enough energy, enough clarity, and enough light stored up to carry us through the rest of human history until the time of Mashiach. And at that very moment, Alexander the Great comes upon Jerusalem, ready to destroy the city, give it over to the Samaritans, let them burn down the temple. And Shimon HaTzadik meets Alexander. Alexander bows in front of him, and an arrangement is made for the Jewish people to continue unmolested, continue lighting the menorah each day, continue living Jewish life. That continues on for approximately another 200 years in the first half of the temple. But then different Greek rulers, Alexander dies only a few years after meeting Shimon HaTzadik. Eventually, the Syrian Greeks take over the dominion over the land of Israel, and they begin this unrelenting persecution of the Jewish people, again, with the goal of eliminating the light that the Jewish people bring to the world, of going into the Beit HaMikdash and defiling the oil, and then laughing at it. They were great scientists. They said, bring me a microscope. Not that they had microscopes then. I'll pour out a little bit of oil that's been defiled, and I'll pour out a little bit of oil that you say is sanctified, and we'll put them under the microscope. And if anybody can show me a difference, I'll give them $1 million. And they laughed and they scoffed. And they said, what you see is what you get. The world is a function of form. Beauty is beauty, skin deep. We have great architecture. We're developing literature. We're developing art. We have everything the world has to offer. Enough with this nonsense of spirituality. Enough with this nonsense of sanctity. If you want light, we can define light. We can measure it. We can determine how fast it goes and how far it reaches. We can eventually, we'll be able to do all those things. Don't give me this idea and concept that when you light the menorah and the oil is sanctified by the Kohen Gadol, and it has that purity and that holiness within it, that it gives off a different quality of life. Don't tell me that you have access to light which clarifies vision, that we with our great wisdom and understanding don't have. They disputed that, and they were out to prove they were right, and they were out to eliminate the competition, because that's the nature of ruling the world. Ruling the world is that my ideas, my concept of reality, my understanding is it. And believe me, and each of us in our own way, we want to rule the world also. And we lack the drive and the commitment to purify our own thinking and our own ideas and our own way of looking at the world through study of Torah, through applying Torah guidelines to our lives for living up to the value system, living up to the mitzvot, fulfilling what Hashem wants us to do. We also feel as though, we know what we see is what there is. But of course, through Torah learning, a person develops and grows and changes and begins to see people around themselves differently, see God's presence in everything, see the meaning in your own life, and so much, and let go of so much animosity and anger and pettiness and things that drag us down and things that stand in the way of us doing kindness and doing chesed and caring about other people and stand in the way of us living. And I want to conclude with a reference, which is really taken from a lecture that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs gave in 2014. But I want to just focus in on this idea of exile. The first temple was destroyed. The Jewish people sat by the rivers of Bavel and they wept. And they said, as we know from the Psalms 137, how can we sing the songs of Hashem in a foreign land? We're done. We're finished without a temple, without lighting the menorah every day. We're over. Because after all, we stood at Mount Sinai. God spoke to us. We built the Mishkan in the temple. That Mishkan stayed with us for 400 years initially when we were in the land of Israel. Then we built the first temple and it stayed with us for 420 years. And now we're exiled. We're crossing this river into a foreign country. We're toast. What does the prophet Yirmiyahu say to them in chapter 29, sentences 5-7? He tells them and he tells us, the Jewish people, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, do not decrease. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to Hashem for it, because as it prospers, you too will prosper. It's an amazing moment in Jewish history. And Yirmiyahu had spent the bulk of his life pleading with the Jewish people to make the changes necessary so that the temple wouldn't be destroyed, was now not just consoling them after its destruction, but he was giving them and us all the insight we would need to survive until now, the year 2021, and please God to survive as long as necessary until Messianic times and until this light, this clarity of light returns to the whole world. It echoes in so many ways the insight that Yosef had in naming his first son. Yirmiyahu's telling the Jewish people, telling us today, transform your troubles, stay connected to your Father's house. Understand that, yes, there's great difficulties and great challenges. Understand that the world is no longer the same, as bright as it has been, but understand that the world can still prosper to the extent that we raise up sons and daughters, continue to build proper Jewish homes, seek to increase in number, seek peace and prosperity to the host country in which we live, and understand that Hashem is still with us and is still just as involved in our lives as he ever has been. Not as overtly, not as openly. It's no longer during this 1,000 years of revelation and prophecy where we're told by the Talmud that when someone had an illness, they would go to the prophet, and the prophet wouldn't give them medicine. The prophet would say, oh, if you can improve in this area of your life, you will heal. And they did. That's the level at which people lived. We can aspire to that too. Of course, we still go to the doctor and we still take our medicine as we have to. But we have this opportunity. Yirmiyahu is saying, don't question how can we sing the songs of Hashem in a foreign land. Let the land remain a foreign land. Let us remember that we're in the process of reconnecting. to the Beit Avi, to the house of our fathers, that we have sons and daughters who we want them also to be so connected. We want to educate them that way. We want to give them the opportunity to be able to see, to be able to distinguish a thing from a person, to be able to see moral and ethical risks in front of them, and to then go back to the Torah and understand how they can be avoided, how we can overcome them, and how we can continue to live lives connected to God and God's plans for the world, and how therefore slowly we light candles, we bring a little bit of light here, a little bit of light there, and as we're told, a little bit of light can dispel a tremendous amount of darkness. We should all have a meaningful Hanukkah, and these lights should stay with us throughout the year, even, and we should keep together learning Torah. It should be a zchut, it should be a merit of those two fathers who passed away, and it should be especially in merit of us having the opportunity to raise children and families and see a continuity of Jewish life, which really impacts the world in ways sometimes very apparent to us and sometimes less apparent. But that's all a function of how we construe how much energy we muster to see through the darkness and see what's really there. Happy Hanukkah. Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Everyone should have a great Hanukkah and keep celebrating and keep benefiting from the light. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Chag Urim Sameach. Bye-bye.
Bye.